Joining us today to celebrate Harmony Fest at the Eureka Centre. I'm Anna Kai, an historian at Sovereign Hill, and I'm honoured to have been asked to facilitate today's event. Just a quick reminder, if you could please check that your mobile phones are switched to silent or turned off, that would be greatly appreciated. I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Wadawurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which the Eureka Centre stands. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any First Nations people attending or watching from home today. Harmony Fest is about coming together to celebrate the cultural diversity that has shaped and continues to shape us. It's about holding up the importance of inclusiveness, as well as respect and belonging for all Australians, regardless of their cultural or linguistic background. This is a Ballarat Harmony Fest event presented by the Eureka Centre in association with the Sovereign Hill Museums Association. Our keynote speaker today is Paul Macgregor. Paul is an historian and heritage consultant who specialises in Chinese diaspora, history and material culture. He is president of the Uncovered Past Institute, which undertakes archaeological excavations with public participation and is excavating the 19th century Harrietville Chinese gold mining village in northeast Victoria. From 1990 to 2005, Paul was curator at Melbourne's Chinese Museum. He is currently researching Chinese economic activity in Australia and the material cultural heritage of Chinese Australians as a part of a wider investigation of the 19th and early 20th century co-evolution of European and Asian societies in Australasia, China, Southeast Asia, North America and the Pacific Indian Ocean. Today, Paul is here to talk to us about the Chinese miners' residence tax revolt of 1859. It's an event that speaks more to disharmony than harmony. However, that doesn't diminish its relevance or its importance with regard to today's celebrations. If we want to encourage harmony to exist, it's important to understand the conditions and the circumstances that have caused harmony to disintegrate in the past, so that we can hopefully prevent it from doing so in the future. So, without further ado, I'll ask Paul to come up to the lectern and present his talk.
Thanks, Hannah, and thank you also to the Eureka Centre and Sovereign Hill for inviting me to present today. I'll just get some water, I think. Suddenly a bit dry. No, good. So I'd also like to as well pay my respects to the Wadawurrung people whose land this Eureka Centre is on, and the story which I'll be talking about today is of two different groups of people from overseas, the Europeans, the British on the one hand, and the Chinese on the other, who had this battle, as I'm about to describe, over who had the right to be in this country. And the Wadawurrung probably at the time would have wished they had the right to kick out the people who were coming in as well. So I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and look forward to finding more about the relationship between Aboriginal people in Ballarat area and both Chinese and European settlers. So today's topic, as Anna said, is a difficult topic of disharmony. It was a very large political and cultural struggle that lasted for about 5-6 years in Victoria. And I'm typifying it as the residence tax revolt of 1859. And this image I've got on the screen is the actual first page of the Act on the 24th of February 1859, which led to the revolt. This is by no means my own research. There are many, many people in Victoria who have looked at this material before. Myra Willard, first one in 1923, A History of the White Australia Policy. In the 60s, Geoffrey Searle, eminent historian, did a whole book on the history of the gold rush and had a whole chapter on the Chinese, and he referred to the tax revolt as well. Catherine Cronin, Colonial Casualties in the early 80s, as well as Andrew Marcus, who looked at racial violence on the gold rushes of Victoria and California. Ian McLaren, who first dug up the Acts of Parliament, upon which my talk is based. And then people like Valerie Lovejoy, who looked at the Bendigo Chinese story, Jerome Small, the Clunes Riot, Keir Reeves, who has done a lot of work on the Castlemaine Chinese, and also with Kevin Wang Hoi, looked at the issue of Chinese agency as political activists in the 1850s. Anna Kai, in the audience today, and my MC, has done an enormous amount of work on the petitions, which I've drawn on heavily for my talk today. And then people like Pauline Rule looked at a particular person called Hoa May, who was an activist in the campaign, Ben Mountford, who's also looked at Castlemaine, Andrew Mesner, popular constitutionalism and the Chinese protest, Liam Ward, Labor historian, looking at Chinese resistance. Myself, my main focus has been Chinese merchants and the politics of the time. And then Ballarat person, Yvonne Horsfield, who is actually of Chinese ancestry, has also done a PhD on the Ballarat Chinese. So it's actually quite interesting that I'm presenting this paper in the early 2020s, when we've had about 20 years of an issue called boat people, and whether the Australian government has the right to detain people and prevent them from settling in their country. And having the experience of lived through, as most of us have, through the politics and the ethics of that question in the last 20 years, or even 30 years, I guess, from the early 90s, it's very interesting to turn that experience back to the 1850s and look at how the government of the day and the people of the day dealt with this issue. So at the time, one of the things that was of concern to some people was that there was a rapid influx of Chinese into the colony of Victoria. There was equally a rapid influx of Europeans and people from America, but that wasn't regarded as a problem, that was regarded as a gift. After the Eureka Stockade riot and rebellion in 1854, the Victorian government commissioned the Goldfields Commission of Inquiry to investigate the problems that had given rise to the battle at Eureka. And one of the things that came up was that there were a lot of complaints by European miners. And when I say European, this was the term that was used in the day to refer to white people. So it included mostly British people, Irish, Scottish and English, but it also included Germans and French and people who were from America of white background. That was the general term European. So many of the European diggers complained that the Chinese were profligate users of water, and as we know, Ballarat is mostly a dry climate, like the rest of most of Australia. So using too much water was a big complaint. The government was also concerned about violence, interracial violence on the goldfields, and there was some. So Andrew Marcus, as I mentioned before, has looked in detail at the instances of violence that have been recorded in the press of the day. 2 instances in Bendigo in 1854, Europeans doing scandalous outrages on the Chinese, altercations constantly between the Europeans and Chinese, and disturbances arising from attempts to prevent Chinese from coming into certain areas. So there was some violence going on. In April 1855, there was about 3,000 Chinese, which is a large increase in the number, and there were calls in the press for restrictive government action. This is an image of Chinese walking through Flemington on the way to the goldfields in 1856. So the government decided to act and enacted an act called an Act to Make Provisions for Certain Immigrants. It didn't say an act to restrict immigration of Chinese, and there was a reason for that, which I'll go into in a short while, but it was awkward to talk about Chinese having a restriction policy against the Chinese. So in the fine print, it says certain immigrants means Chinese. And the most important thing that was instigated was a £10 poll tax, and a poll tax is a tax per head. Each person gets charged that. When they arrived at a port, in any port in Victoria, they had to pay £10. That had to be paid by the ship's captain, who had to collect that from all the passengers. And that came into effect from the 1st of November. So this was supposed to make it too expensive for Chinese people to arrive. What was the result of that? Well, in that period of 1855, there was an increasing amount of violence between Europeans and Chinese. at Ballarat, Wattle Gully, Castlemaine, Sailors Creek, Dalesford, mostly Europeans attacking Chinese. Again, it complains about water usage. But interestingly, in Bendigo, when agitators tried to attract an audience to an anti-Chinese meeting, very few people turned up. So in terms of the arrivals and departures, so I'll just hone in on this a bit more. So this is the column is the arrivals by sea. This is the arrivals overland, departures by sea. So Chinese were both coming and going. So like Europeans, many would come for the gold for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and then go somewhere else or go back to China. And so it was never just a static income and then not going out again. So we have a net per year column, the increase or decrease, and then a cumulative total of those increases. Now these figures are from the government's poor statistics. They don't match up with the census figures. So the census says that there is only 2,000 Chinese in 1854, whereas the poor statistics say there were over 7,000. In 1857, it says the census says only 25,000, whereas the cumulative total of poor figures is 30,000. What you'll note here, 14,616 coming overland, whereas only 816 came by ship, compared to 1855, 1856, when there were thousands of people arriving. So in that respect, the poll tax did stop people arriving at the ports of Victoria. But they came overland. So before we get into the overland issue, let's just look at how the population of Chinese figured in terms of the proportion of the population. So in 1858, at the end of 1858, there were 500,000 people in Victoria according to the census. And of those, 205,000 were living in the goldfields, and out of those, 113,000 non-Chinese men were on the goldfields. And then the Chinese men were pretty much all miners, with 33,000. So in 1858, it was 7% of the population of Victoria were Chinese, but 23% of the goldfields population was Chinese. And in May 59, at the height of Chinese numbers, 45,000 Chinese on the goldfields, that was 30% of the population on the goldfields and 9% of the population of Victoria. And that decreased by the end of the year. So it was a peak in the middle of that year, which I'll explain in a minute. So why did they stop coming by ship, and why did they come from overland? So here's a map. At those days, travelling from Hong Kong or China to Australia was by sail, and you had to follow the winds, and the easiest way to do that is to go straight south through what's now Indonesia, and then go due east with the roaring 40s to come to Melbourne. And then the return route for the ship would be up the east coast and back up to Hong Kong. So what happened when people didn't want to pay the £10 poll tax is that the ships stopped at the port of Robe, or as it was called in 1856-57, Guichin Bay, and then the Chinese then had to walk overland. And that overland walk, which Charles, who'll be at the table this afternoon, has done the walk 3 times, is that a reenactment? Charles Zhang. That walk could take between 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how fast you walk and whether you had horses or whatever. But mostly it was walking. And some of it was desert, dry area, and there are stories that some Chinese suffered from great thirst and died along the way. I'm not sure about the evidence. Charles will talk a bit more about that. There were 32 ships over the course of 1857, and they debarked 15,000 Chinese from their ships, and then they all walked. Now here's an example of an article that depicted one of those arrivals in Ballarat, 2nd of March 1857. 164 Chinese arrived in Ballarat yesterday afternoon after a 3 weeks overland journey. The chief portion of their baggage was on 2 bullock trays, and the party This was a third party of Chinese conducted overland by the same men with their bullock drays. So the Chinese rail was just swapped to walking over the border from South Australia. The Victorian government wasn't happy about that, so it leaned upon the South Australian government, who then responded by saying, well, we'll institute our own passenger tax of £10, the same. So that stopped the people arriving from South Australia. However, New South Wales, also appealed to by the colonial government, refused to pass a similar bill. 3 times that bill was put up into Parliament, and 3 times the Legislative Council over 1857-61 chose to vote against it. So for the whole period of the 1850s, for the period of time I'm talking about, New South Wales was a free landing option for Chinese. And as a result, there was also a large cohort of people arriving from both Twofold Bay, which is now Eden, and also Sydney. And 12,000 arrived in New South Wales in 1858, of whom about 9,000 went to Victoria. So a similar number walked from New South Wales, maybe about 2/3 similar to what walked from South Australia. And in that period, the violence against Chinese continued in some respects. So because of this pattern of violence against Chinese people by European miners, the government instituted policies to try and separate out the races and protect the Chinese from violence. And so the very Act of 1855 that set up the poll tax also set up rules and allowed the government to set up rules and regulations to register Chinese immigrants in their localities where they were living and working, and to generally manage and provide for good governance of such immigrants. So how the government implemented that was they required Chinese miners to pay a protection ticket, which was £1 a year, and they designated Chinese camps where the Chinese had to live, so this was the form of apartheid. Chinese protectors were employed to run that system. Chinese interpreters, and that is people who are actually Chinese, were employed as interpreters to translate from English into Chinese and vice versa. And then there were camp headmen appointed, who were usually from the members of the mining community, Chinese mining community. If you didn't pay the ticket or you didn't follow the rules of the protection system, then you could be fined up to £5 or 2 months imprisonment. Just to get idea of the cost of £5, at that time, a weekly wage for a miner would be between £1 to £2 a week, depending on how good their mining returns were. So that's, we're talking about a week's salary is the cost of an annual ticket, and 2 to 3 weeks' salary is the fine if you don't do that. There were 4 protectors set up across Victoria. One of them was Frederick Standish of Bendigo, and he reported that he was obliged to have 3 policemen at my disposal out every day asking for protection tickets on the same system as the old licence hunting. Now, he knew that his readers would know that refers to what caused the Eureka Rebellion. Troopers out there hunting for miners' licences. So the miners' licences were revoked by the government after Eureka, but now we have the Chinese be given the same licence that they had to pay for the ticket. But the system had some support because it provided some physical protection to the Chinese and reduced the amount of petty persecution in their daily life. However, the system was not applied equally in all fields, and I believe Ballarat was not as assiduously applied as in Bendigo or in Beechworth. Standish, I believe, had a military background, whereas Foster, W.H. Foster, who was in Ballarat, I believe, had not so much of a military background. The net result was in 1856, only about half of the Chinese paid their protection ticket. The Chinese camps were required of the Chinese to live away from their workings, which they had to carry their equipment backwards and forwards from the goldfields every day for their mining claims, and that otherwise they could have it stolen. They were forbidden, Bendigo, they were forbidden to leave the district without permission. And Protector Standish assigned police to patrol the main roads and send back Chinese strays or escapees by force if necessary. So you can see that's a very draconian approach to managing civil order. But that had to stop because the Attorney General ruled that the protectors had no power to rule over where Chinese could place their tents, and Standish was forced to disband his patrols. And in fact, the camp system became very difficult to manage, and it was a protector's nightmare, in the words of the day. So the government, let's say 1856, the first full year after it had been implemented, they raised $21,000 from landing taxes and protection tickets, and they spent $9,000 on managing that system. So they were making a £10,000 profit, which is probably about $6 million worth now. So that's quite a lot of benefit from punitively discriminating against Chinese. And if a Chinese person wanted to complain, they could complain about something with a protector, they had to pay a fee of £2. So 1 to 2 weeks' salary just to lodge a complaint. There are not many, in fact, I don't think there are any photographs of Chinese in the 1850s, but here's one from a bit later of Chinese in the Ovens Valley in the Beechworth area, mining gold from a river that they drained. And I bring this photo up because, as some of you may know, there was an infamous riot against Chinese in Buckland in 1857. And what I believe is this had a pivotal effect upon the residence tax system and the revolt in 1859. So I'll go into this in a bit more detail. It was the first major anti-Chinese riot on Australian goldfields. At that time in the Buckland Valley, which is near the Ovens Valley, the mining community of 1,500 to 2,000 Chinese and approximately 700 whites. It's an isolated valley in the Victorian Alps. Very cold in winter, so 4th of July is a very cold day. The riot consisted of about 100 white men driving all of those Chinese out of the valley with violence. Most of the tents and property of the Chinese were destroyed or stolen, including the premises, stock and cash of at least 17 stores or cookshops. Several Chinese died, many more were injured. There were no police presence on the Buckland, despite months of tension and calls for police to come. The nearest police were 50 miles away, in the district capital of Beechworth. Police only arrived 2 days after the riot. So what's of interest to me is not just that there was this riot, but what happened after the riot. So the riot occurs, the ringleaders are rounded up, there's a trial, and they are charged, and eventually they're released by a jury of white men. On the other hand, Chinese storekeepers petitioned for compensation, and 2 MLAs, or members of the Legislative Assembly, Aspinall and Service, presented petitions from Chinese in Victoria against the tax proposed to be levied upon them. Aspinall asks if the government intended to compensate those persons who, by British outrage, have been deprived of their property. The Chief Secretary, Haynes, said that those who had their property destroyed will be compensated. The warden had provided a report. The government was disposed to provide compensation, at least to all the Chinese who had taken the precaution of obtaining protection tickets. And that gives a bit of argy-bargy. It goes on for a while. The board is appointed and the board has its hearings and its final report is on the 31st of December, so a whole 6 months after the riot. And the thing went on. So Young, Tup and Quinhua, who were 3 of the shopkeepers, have their solicitor write to the Chief Secretary complaining of the delay in the releasing of the report and the provision of compensation. Aspinall asks, has the reports been submitted? Who was to be compensated? How would the claimants find out? 5th of February, it was announced that £7,000 would be compensated to the Chinese, and then that was officially made known in 20th of March. And the names of individuals per storekeeper are published. But neither the report nor the rationale for the report. The report's provided, but not the rationale for the report. There are some press articles incredulous at the amount, challenging the need for compensation, questioning the untrustworthiness of Chinese claims, want to see evidence, demand the report be released. Not until April not until the end of April was the report actually provided to the Parliament. And then finally, on the 5th of May, the approved Chinese claimants were paid to the Treasury. So this is almost a year after they'd had their property destroyed. And this is the report. And you can see it's tied up with red tape. And I don't think this report's been looked at since it was reported in Parliament, because you had to actually have to untie the thing, and the person who tied it with the Public Records Office says, I don't think anybody's untied this for a long time. And no historian has ever reported on this information, so I believe I'm the first person to see it since 1858, probably. It's a summary of those who were compensated. This is in writing. The report is 50 pages. All except 2 claimants were in possession of protection tickets, and the 2 exceptions were naturalised British subjects. Basically, the board members regarded the complaints as valid, and the amounts of losses were valid as well. But the report does not mention the nature of the riot, nor the perpetrators, nor the narrative events causing the property destruction, nor that the government had failed to provide protection for the Chinese miners, nor was there any mention of consideration of compensation for all the other 2,000 miners for their losses. There was no further public discussion. The report addresses all the claims raised in Parliament and the press. There are apparently no more new articles that I could find about the proceedings, and the report findings never appear to have been published in the press either. It appears to have been quietly forgotten, perhaps never read again for 160 years, except in the 31st of May 1859, in the height of the residence tax riot, residence tax campaign, the Chief Secretary, then John O'Shannessy, argued to a delegation of merchants that the 1857 compensation package exceeded the sums that had been earned from the protection tickets that year, which had only been voluntarily paid. The government was concerned that future riots may require further large compensation payments, and so that's why this residence tax was issued. And that's why we had the Revolt of 1859. So these are 2 articles by Anna Kai, where she's gone into investigation of one way in which the Chinese campaigned against these proposals. There are a range of petitions. These are 3 that in 1856, December 1856, by Chinese. Then, at the instigation of the first Chinese residence tax, or as it was going into Parliament, there were petitions both from the Chinese, from Europeans for the Chinese, and by Europeans against the Chinese. So on the left where it's black, on the right I've got yellow. So it's almost like a social media war between the 2 camps as to who could get the ear of government and get their views acknowledged by the government. Petitions from various Chinese in various locations. Here's one of those petitions. It's 9.5 metres long. 3,000 Chinese in Castlemaine, organised by Zhua Luk, who's one of the interpreters, 1857. There was some more in early 1858. And this, as I said, was around the first residence tax, which was issued on the 4th of November 1857. And this tax basically was to raise the money that the government wasn't getting sufficiently from the protection tickets or the poll taxes from people arriving over the border. So this new tax was £6 a year, but there were no penal clauses. If you didn't pay it, then you weren't get fined. However, if you were unlicensed, if you didn't have a ticket, then you were barred from legal protection and you're unable to institute legal proceedings if someone jumped your claim. This Act was refused to be voted for in Parliament by 3 MPs, one of whom was Peter Lalor, the leader of the Eureka Rebellion, as well as J.D. Wood and B.C. Aspinall, who campaigned on behalf of the Chinese, the Buckland Riot. Because there were no penal clauses, though, all but a few hundred Chinese ignored the tax. And at this stage, there were 30,000 Chinese or more in Victoria. So in late 58, Shannon decided to come down hard. He issued a new act, an act to consolidate and amend the laws affecting the Chinese immigrating to a resident in Victoria. He reduced the annual licence fee from £6 to £4, but he said, I would now ensure it will be collected. And included in that is sealing the Murray border by imposing a £4 entry tax on Chinese coming overland. So the troopers and the police were required to collect, and if the Chinese weren't paying, they could be fined and imprisoned. So there is a major uprising by the Chinese. A United Confederacy of Chinese is formed in 1859. A proclamation is issued setting forth that they were unjustly taxed and calling upon diggers and puddlers to suspend operations, and for all Chinese storekeepers to close their place of business and have no dealings with Europeans. They were to refuse to pay the tax, and when the attempt was made to enforce it by the police, the gong was to be sounded in their encampments, and they were to follow en masse the officer and his prisoner to the headquarters of the government officials and hold an indignation meeting. The United Confederacy of Chinese also issued an order that if you didn't follow these rules, you'd be had to pay a fine of £3 to the Confederacy, and a reward was given to informers. They also said they were going to offer a £200 reward to anyone who could kill a certain government official. We don't know who that official was yet. So this Confederacy went into action on 11th of May. The Chinese, or just before the 11th of May, there was a monster meeting, which is a large meeting in Bendigo, and the speakers, Chinese speakers, flanked by the Union Jack on the one hand and the flag of the Bendigo Chinese movement against the new tax, outlined the resistance campaign. I have not seen this flag. I'd love to know what this flag looked like. On the 11th of May, when police arrested unlicensed Chinese at White Hills, the pre-arranged response took effect. Gongs were sounded, fireworks shot into the air, and hundreds of Confederate supporters rushed to the scene. Several spirited Chinese fought with the police and freed the Chinese arrestees, but the police fired their rifles, charged the crowd and regained the prisoners. Again, on cue, hundreds of Chinese gave themselves up to the police, declaring too that they were unlicensed, and following the now bewildered constables back to the Bendigo township. As they came near the town, more and more Chinese joined the procession, until when they reached the lockup, the police again knocked and punched by angry Chinese. The still handcuffed prisoners were finally collected into their cells, but hundreds of Chinese remained all day seated defiantly into the square. There was a general refusal to pay, and the jails were soon crowded. Now, this is stirring political action. The Confederacy acts again in Castlemaine a couple of weeks later. 3,000 Chinese marched to the warden's ward and demanded to be arrested. They also adopted a non-intercourse policy of spending all business with Chinese. And there's this quote, "Why this tax on Chinamen? Chinamen pay for what they eat. Chinamen work very hard, but little earn money and can't afford to pay tax. We obey the law. We make no noise. We have feelings like other men. We want to be brothers with the Englishmen. Why not let this be so?" There was a delegation at the end of May to the Chief Secretary in Melbourne, led by Lo Kong Meng, John Luke and Arcon, representing 200 merchants in Melbourne. They also had James Grant, a Member of Parliament, Mark Last King, a merchant, and the Reverend William Young, who was a missionary to the Chinese, with them acting on their behalf as well. Chief Secretary of Tennessee refused to exempt them from the tax, and 2 days later 150 Melbourne Chinese marched to the Treasury in their finest outfits to pay the tax. Some did pay after the riots of May. Most, however, refused, and many actually left Victoria. In the first month of the new scheme, only 160 Chinese had paid the tax. Over 1859, only 12,000 paid out of a total population of 45,000. 33,000 did not pay the tax. This is a very large movement. By early 1860, 4,000 had been fined and 2,000 imprisoned for non-payment. In 1860, only 8,000 had paid. In 1861, only 5,000 paid. And over the course of 1859, 1860, about 10,000 moved to the new goldfields in New South Wales. And this is a Watch House charge book from Wim Hold, which I believe is not far from Ballarat, which was found at an auction a few years ago, and a few of us got together to purchase it because it has the records of Chinese being imprisoned for not paying the residence tax. So this is a random page from this period in late 1859. And then detail here you can see Ah Ho and Ah Lu, and both charged with, what's the word they use? Having no residence licence, and they're put in jail. The campaign of petitions resumes in June, in fact in late May. There were several petitions across the course of the year. One of those petitions came from 5,000 Chinese in Ballarat on the 20th of June 1859. Quite interestingly, the head signature on this is Chin Kit, the headman for the village at Eureka, the Chinese village. There's also 2 headmen at the Golden Point village, which is not far from where we are now, and several merchants from Main Road, again not far from where we are right now. So in summary, this Chinese opposition to the residence tax composed of passive resistance, that is overlanding, avoiding paying the residence tax, active campaigning, direct lobbying, delegations to the government, letters to newspapers, petitions, public meetings, civil disturbance and protest, forming a confederacy to fight this campaign, a tax strike, a consumer strike, and walkouts from camps. They engaged in mass incarceration and mass payments as protest. They undertook legal action, and they worked with Europeans who were assisting them. And then even in 1865, Kong Meng was asked to bring Chinese over to New Zealand for the mining there, and he refused to allow Chinese to go to New Zealand unless the government there guaranteed their freedom of movement. So it's a very sophisticated and a very large campaign. Was it successful? I'll get to that in a minute. So the opposition to immigration restriction was both Chinese people and Europeans. The Melbourne Chamber of Commerce argued there should be free movement of people, there would be equality of peoples, that there's a treaty between Britain and China which should allow free movement between the 2 empires. Some people say, like Geoffrey Searle, this is a self-interest of merchants and labour employers, but I think it's a larger issue of what you consider to be human rights. And the New South Wales Legislative Council opposed immigration restrictions and only implemented them after they had their own rights in Landing Flat 1861. So those are 2 of the leaders of the Chinese community opposition, Lau Kong Meng on the left and Louis Amoy on the right, both merchants in Melbourne, although Louis Amoy had many interests in the goldfields as well. And they're both from the San Yat district and the Siap district, which are 2 regions in here's Hong Kong, here's Canton or Guangzhou as it is now, Sam Yap and Siap, and they formed associations based on the district of origin when they came to Australia. I've peppered my presentation today with mentions of various Europeans in Parliament who are advocates for the Chinese. B.C. Aspinall, who was active in the campaign for the Chinese and the Buckland riot, was also one of the chief counsel for the leaders of the Ballarat riots, the Eureka Rebellion. And James Service, he in 1880, when he was Premier, it was alleged that he had organised for the whole of the then Chinese population of Victoria to vote for him in that election. And then when he was defeated in 1880, the new Premier Graham Berry introduced legislation to ban Chinese in Victoria from voting in October 1880. And then there's James Grant, Peter Lawler and J.D. Wood. So there's at least 6 MPs who were supportive of the Chinese. And then various merchants in various goldfields towns, European and Chinese, combined together to petition the government to reduce the tax, this is 1861, from £4 to £2. The combined pressure of the Chinese agitation, the residents' revolt, residence tax revolt, their civil disobedience, and also the lobbying in Parliament, in the press and to government directly, led to all the restrictions being lifted. Again, Searle argues that this was mercantile pressure on the government to remove these restrictions, but I think it was a bigger, more fundamental issue. In 1861, South Australia was the first to abolish its tax. In 1862, Victoria abolished its licence tax. In 1863, the Victorian entry tax was provisionally abolished, and finally in 1865. And even though New South Wales brought in its own poll tax in 1861, it revoked that in 1867. And in Victoria, from the mid-1865 to late 1880, there were no discriminatory regulations against the Chinese in Victoria at all. So, in that sense, it was a successful campaign. It took 2 years, but it won. So after this campaign, we see larger numbers of Chinese working on goldfields across Victoria, and they became the main alluvial gold workers in our colony. And this is a very well-known photograph of the Chinese at Guildford near Castlemaine, working in large workings with their community in the background. So I mentioned that the last discriminatory tax was abolished in 1865. In 1866, the Siap Society built an amazing new temple in South Melbourne. I suspect this was thanks to their gods for bringing victory. In 1866, the Commercial Bank of Australia invites Lower Kongming and Louis Amoy to be the first shareholders and depositors and directors of their bank. And they specifically wanted to attract Chinese customers, and they issued pound notes for 50 years with Chinese as well as European writing on them, English writing. In 1867, the Chinese initiated this arch. The Chinese residents welcomed Prince Alfred on his tour of Victoria. In 1860s to the 1870s, market gardeners' licences were issued in both Chinese and in English. Was Victoria a multilingual society? The Chinese Quarter in Ballarat in 1868 was a thriving, profitable and prosperous area. There were Chinese communities right across Victoria in 1868, and the Chinese population of Australia was stable for about 20 years after that. I'll just skip through the next one. Go to this. The themes of racism. Throughout this, we have the issue of public order as a reason or excuse for discrimination. I haven't mentioned it, but some of the people have argued, some scholars now are arguing that homosexuality of Chinese, large numbers of Chinese men congregated together, was part of the reason why there was this racism. There was also a connection with the anti-transportation movement. They didn't want Chinese to replace convicts as labour. There's a parallel with the treatment of Aborigines. And there's also parallels with biological purity movements and the issue of rapid influx causing racism, which Blaney and Howard repeated in the 1980s in Australia. There are also legal issues at point here. Does any government have a general legal responsibility to non-British subjects in Victoria, New South Wales, and specifically the subjects of China? There was a treaty between China and Britain which allowed free movement between each other's empires and requiring each government to protect subjects of another empire. Malcolm Oakes, a colleague of mine who's a SC, Queen's Counsel in New South Wales, argues that there was a sense of common humanity, allied with grace and favour, and grant of monies for compensation. Peter Prince argues that British Chinese, those born in the empire, which are technically and legally British, should have been allowed to settle here, but they were treated as discriminatorily by the colonial authorities here. Also, the British Empire of the time was a multiracial community. And was this the empire that New South and Victoria wanted or didn't want? And finally, the implication, the legal basis of exclusion. This has never been investigated by historians before Peter Prince started looking at this recently. So, claims against Chinese as not being appropriate residents of Australia on the one hand, versus the fact that Chinese non-subjects have equivalence with British subjects before the law in Australia in a whole range of areas. They're equally liable for criminal offences. They can be taken to court. They can engage in civil suits, even though they're not British subjects. They can marry British subjects. They can rent and carry on a business. Their economic activity is taxable and registrable. And they were even able to elect parliamentarians and local councillors in Victoria and New South Wales. But they weren't allowed to own real estate unless they were naturalised. So the legal basis for exclusion is not strong and was not strong. And what does not being a subject exclude you from? Did the same rights and exclusions apply to other non-British Empire foreigners such as Germans, Americans, Afghans, who were also in Australia at that time? And my last slide. When we look back at this time in the 19th century, we can pick out and aggregate events and time periods and people. I think we have to be a bit cautious about taking that approach and drill down into what was happening at different places with different people. We shouldn't just aggregate, well, the Chinese were like this, the Europeans were like that. We should find out that there were people on both sides who were both good and bad and cooperated and worked against each other. Attitudes can be different from one district to the other. Attitudes are not constant over time. They change from year to year, from decade to decade, as we know from the politics of our own generation. So let's look back on the 19th century as a time of rapid change of politics, and there was both good and bad. And let's also consider that the Chinese Residence Tax Revolt of 1859 was equal to the Eureka Rebellion and should get more acknowledgement in Australian history. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for that interesting talk. We'll now have a discussion about the talk, and I'd like to invite Charles Zhang to come and sit up on the panel with us today. Charles was born in China and came to Australia in 1989, living in Ballarat since 1998. He is currently president of the Chinese Australian Cultural Society in Ballarat, Incorporated, and vice president of the Ballarat Chinese Dragon Boat Club. From 2010 to 2011, Charles was the City of Ballarat Multicultural Ambassador, and from 2001 to 2017, he was the Ethnic Coordinator and the Board Director of 99.9 Voice FM. In 2011, Charles was awarded the Pride of Australian Medal, and in 2016, he was awarded the Ballarat Citizen of the Year. Charles's experiences will allow us to explore another thread that's connected to the Chinese responses to discriminatory legislation that was imposed on them during the latter half of the 1850s. In December 2013, Charles and his son Oscar retraced the steps of the Chinese who travelled overland from Robe, South Australia to the Victorian goldfields. This journey took them 14 days, I think, and they travelled 400 kilometres. In 2016, Charles also undertook another journey. This time he travelled from Melbourne to Robe and took 20 people with him. So could you please welcome Charles Zhang with us today? That was a really enjoyable talk. Thank you, Paul. Just a few questions. Throughout the latter half of the 1850s, we know that the Chinese protested in various ways, whether it be through tax evasion, arriving overland, as we've talked, presenting petitions, holding protest meetings. What makes the 1859 protest so different or significant to earlier protest actions? What makes it boil over to such tension and conflict at this particular point?
It was the fact that the various discriminations had been going on for some time, but that the earlier tax, residence tax, had no penal clauses, so you could get away with not paying it. So when the second tax of February 1859 came in, then that required Chinese to actually pay the tax, or to pay a fine, or to go to jail. And they just refused to pay that. And that then basically bowled over. we're not going to pay this, they said. And so they even, as I said in my paper, they would go to jail and have rights rather than pay the tax. Yeah. So it was just that, like, you can't keep trying to do this, and you're going to make forces to do it that we're going to really kick back.
So the harsher penalties, the stronger enforcement of the tax, increases the anger and resentment, similar to Eureka. The increased licence hunts drives up the anger and the retaliation. Because it's interesting to note, when I've looked at the 1859 protests in Ballarat, yes, there were petitions, but it doesn't seem to reach that fiery kind of standard that it does in Bendigo and Castlemaine. And, some of the things, the report saying, well, there's not as much tension here in Ballarat because the residence licences aren't collected as severely as they are on those other goldfields. So, there could be variability, like you were saying before, on the goldfields in terms of who was operating the protectorate system or who was the Chinese protector at that particular time. So it's something we should take into consideration. This next question is something that I think both of you can hopefully be involved in. When we look at this particular period or this episode of Chinese-Australian history, what do you think are the most significant factors that contribute to the racial tension that emerges at this particular time?
Do you want to go first, Charles?
From my point of view, that would be at when the Ballarat was many early people looking for alluvial gulfs. Mm-hmm. So 1859, the most alluvial gulfs start to exhaust, and people start to spread out. Mm-hmm. And but that was the peak time when the Chinese from overseas coming into Ballarat region, large in numbers. So obviously there's some conflict between the new arrivals and the one already here. And the new arrivals, and they didn't understand the system. And but the one already here for a couple of years, they probably learned the Australia way, learned the way very quickly. So for this instance, and there's some conflict between Chinese as well.
So there's this alluvial gold, which is the easy gold that the miners first came for, and quite a few people could look for that type of gold because the tools that you needed were simple and affordable, but that starts to run out as the 1850s progresses, and so there's more competition for that type of gold deposit, and not everyone can move into mining the deep leads or the quartz mining. They can't afford to do that, so there's more people competing for shallow alluvial gold, and the Chinese arriving in large numbers. So this is one of the arguments put forth for the increase in racial tension at this time, is the economic competition that increases. And when after the Eureka Rebellion, in the aftermath of that, and they replaced the gold licence with the miner's right, the more affordable miner's right, it raises fears that it will increase Chinese immigration, that the Chinese will see this as incentive, hence the direct need to introduce that immigration poll tax. So the two events, the outcomes of the Eureka Rebellion and the immigration poll tax, are directly linked. Would you like to add any further ideas into what you think?
Sure.
I
think the question still needs to be asked: why did those economic difficulties generate racial conflict and racial tension? And it needs to be borne in mind that the government of the day, as I said, forced Chinese to live in separate Chinese camps, and they were often quite away from where the Europeans were living and running their goldfields. So there was very little opportunity for Chinese and Europeans to interact with each other. One big difference in that system was Ballarat. So the Ballarat Chinese camps, Golden Point, Eureka, I don't know all the names of them, but there were several. They were mostly quickly, they were settled quite early, like because Ballarat was one of the earliest fields in Victoria. So they were already established in 1855. By 1859, the European community of Ballarat had actually grown and was actually intermingled with the Chinese camps in eastern Ballarat. And Jerome Small, I've had him briefly on a slide, but I didn't talk about it in my paper, my presentation. But he says that in 1873, when the European owners of a mine in Clunes faced a strike from the European miners, and they decided they would recruit Chinese workers to work in their mines instead. And the first people they turned to were the Chinese in East Ballarat. And what happened, though, is that the unionists from Clunes went to Ballarat and talked with the Chinese miners here. And the Chinese said, "So we're not going to break your strike. We're going to stand in solidarity with you." Instead, what happened was that the mining owners went to Creswick, which is another nearby town, as you know, where the Chinese camp had always remained separate from the European part of town, and where there was very little intermixing. So the Chinese didn't even know that there was a strike going on in Clunes. And they just were offered, contract work for a period of time. They turned up in a coach, and they were attacked by an angry mob of the unionists. It was the fact that the Europeans and the Chinese of Ballarat actually got to know each other that led to the commonality of understanding and the separation caused by the government itself, which paradoxically increased the racism.
So we're looking at factors such as geology and the type of competition that it creates, and the geography as well, what close proximity or the distance between, or the separation between European and Chinese. Would you like to add anything further to that, Charles? Or?
Yes, I totally agree with what Paul said. Particularly in Ballarat, and the Chinese was living in the heart of the town, and they mixed with the Europeans, and particularly in the early stage, and 99.99% the Chinese miners were the male. So that's after a little while, there's lots of intercultural marriage between Chinese men and Irish women and others. So with this mixer, so obviously there will be lots of cultural conflict as well as other issues.
And so we've acknowledged, or Paul's acknowledged, that some Europeans supported the Chinese in their protests, and in Ballarat we have the likes of Chinese protector William Henry Foster, who helped the Chinese rewrite laws and probably didn't collect licences as heavily as on other goldfields. We have James Oddie, who also attended Chinese protests and gave them his support. I'm just wondering, what do you think, or what... I think it's important that we explore the potential for harmony to arise, to understand what made these individuals think differently to others. What enabled them to have a more accepting and perhaps supporting point of view of the Chinese, to see, made them different to, those who were against the Chinese. Any ideas on that?
I mentioned Myra Willard wrote her history of the White Australia policy in 1923. She makes a strong point about the cultural politics of 1850s, 1860s in Australia amongst the European, amongst the British, amongst the white community. And she divided the politics of the day into those who were cosmopolitan and those who were parochial. Those who wanted to have a mix of cultures and interaction between Australia and other parts of the world, and a free flow of people and goods and money and ideas. That type of pan-cultural empire approach, versus those who wanted to narrow down our society in Australia and make it into a one race, one culture, the British Australian ideal. And
that gets back to what you're saying, that we need to realise that there's diversity of opinion between each cultural group. They're not all the same, of the same view as people are today.
Well, I guess the other thing I wanted to say about that is that we look back on that time and see what the government did, what it achieved, the acts that are put through Parliament, the discriminatory programs that it required their police and troopers to engage. We don't generally in terms of popular history, and I understand that there was debate, there was differences of opinion, there was argument in press, there were letters to the press supporting the Chinese. That gets often forgotten when we look back on the past, and we only see, we join up the dots of racism and say, well, that time was racist.
Yes. It's either black or white.
It's either black or white. Yeah, yeah.
And it's a bit murkier and more complex than that. Maybe it's because it's easier for people to accept a more simplistic view of history, and the complexity gets lost in the process with trying to package that history up for people. I mean, and my next question was that, you mentioned that the tax revolt of 1859 was equal to the Eureka Rebellion in terms of miners demanding rights and fair treatment. But what do you think has been the most significant obstacle in preventing this story from entering the public's imagination? What's hindered it from reaching the same level?
Well, with Eureka Rebellion, if you look at that, it was partly against paying the miners' licences, but it was also about no taxation without representation. So one of the consequences of the Eureka Rebellion was that the franchise was extended to all males, and miners were able to vote, miners were able to get elected to Parliament, and so we got the leader of the Eureka Rebellion, Peter Lawler, becoming an MP in Victoria. And so what you get is not only a change in the politics after Eureka within a few years, you also get a sense that, well, that was all in the past. We had tyranny under Latrobe and Hotham, and now we don't have that. And so we can look back on Eureka as a watershed change in Australia's political history. We can't say that about the Residence Tax Revolt of 1859 because we can't say before that there was racism and after that there wasn't. Yeah. Because we've then had the poll taxes came back in 1880. The Immigration Restriction Act of the Federal Australian Government, instituted in 1901, only fully disbanded in 1973. And we again have racism towards immigrants, whether they be Muslim or black or Asian. And so it's uncomfortable for the majority of Australians to look back and say, well, we can be proud of what happened in 1859 because the echoes of that racism is still here and now, and we can't deal with that easily. It
ultimately leads us to question how we celebrate and recognise Eureka as well, and all the winnings or all the the changes that happened afterwards, because we celebrate we became a more democratic society, but actually that democracy is built on excluding a particular group of people and not allowing them the same access to the gold that all other immigrants in the colony had at the time, isn't it? So I think it makes it tricky in that way, but also I think, like as we've discussed before, it's not an instant success story like you have after Eureka. There's not this free flow, and when you have a narrative in history, people go for that battle, that quick change as well. I think that's an obstacle for historians to try and make this more appealing, to show to the wider audience about why this story is so interesting and so important. Charles, in what ways do you think we should seek to remember these experiences from the past? And, I mean, you've taken the walk from from Ballarat to Rove and then back again. What ways do you think we can or should encourage commemoration of the Chinese experiences during this time?
Very good question, and I'm Chinese, so I'm talking about it from my Chinese point of view, and I'm also Australian. So I think important is communications, and from my understanding, the reason I'm mentioning about that is Ballarat has one of the first, I think, in the world, the dual language newspaper, Chinese and English. And at that time, I think particularly after 1859, Victoria colonial government spent a great effort to put the information through to various communities, particularly Chinese community. They actually pay to get the government information print on the newspaper in Chinese. And so I think that's to have information world across, have more people understanding, know the information, that will help to ease lots of misunderstanding and have lots of, which is a good communication, always a good starting point. And sometimes good intention might not having a good result, but to my understanding, even in nowadays, I'm one of the liaison officers between federal government certain department and the Chinese community in Ballarat. And we actually found out from last 2-3 years with the COVID pandemic, with those information from the federal government through to community leaders, then pass on to community, and that will help a great deal for for Chinese community. They can have a good understanding how government wants to do, and also they can work with the government in certain way. Maybe not 100% all the time, but in most cases, and Chinese community, they actually working within the government policy. And so in that case, that will reduce lots of little conflict or misunderstanding. And you probably know the bigger problem always build up from the small problems. And that's my point.
So greater access to the stories, greater cross-cultural communication, so future misunderstandings are prevented. What do you think, Paul? How do you think we should we commemorate? In what ways should we commemorate? How do we encourage this story to be a stronger part of people's public, the popular memory as such, that the Eureka has managed to attain? Or do you think that won't be possible?
Well, I think even with Eureka, it's hard to get the story beyond a certain superficial understanding in the community of a rebellion and the drama of the attack and the deaths and all that sort of stuff. But a lot of Australians don't really understand the democratic implications of Eureka until they come to a place like this. I think there aren't easy answers to how you get this more widely known amongst the community. I think for much of my career, working in Chinese Australian history, the focus has been on, for me and for many of my colleagues, has been on helping people to understand the actual community, to understand the lives, the family stories, the biographies of Australians who were Chinese. And we have focused less on the racism and the violence in the last 20 years. But now with the increase in racism again towards Chinese over the COVID issue and the bilateral difficulties between China and Australian governments, then that's required us to think a bit more about the history of racism in Australia. But it's still hard to get that through. A lot of people don't want to think about it. So I would say we need to have more public education. We need to have a centre like this that talks about it. I would dream that Eureka Centre would actually have a section devoted to the 1859 tax revolt. But we could have more exhibitions in other places as well as this. We could have books published about it. We could have TV series. There's a whole way we've got across. But I think the story is really fascinating and gripping. Yeah. And I just think it needs to be picked up and run with, really.
Charles, what made you decide to do the walk from Robe, or walk to Robe? What motivated you to do so?
As I said, as I'm Chinese and living in Ballarat for 25 years, and the walk from Robe to Central Victoria, that was unknown to me until I've been told by friends. I said, wow, that's fascinating. And so I went to Robe, and then I found a bit more information. And the more information I found, the more I want to have my personal experience about this work. And obviously, the reason we know why Chinese they landed in Robe and walked into the Central Victoria goldfield is purely avoid the poll tax. And so 2013, I had an window opportunity for a month. So I took my younger son, Oscar. He was 16 at the time. And we made a decision. We walked from Robe back to Ballarat. But we actually selected the wrong time of year. That was December. It was the hottest time of the year. And obviously, because that, I had more understanding of how difficult the Chinese they did work. And obviously, they didn't have a freeway. They didn't have a supporting. They didn't have a proper food and prepared food. They even didn't have much fresh water available during that time. I think the most important they didn't have is they were foreigners. They were no knowledge of anything about Australia. At least we are here. My son was born in here, and I've been living in Australia for more than 30 years. Also, that was very difficult for us, and we, particularly from Robe to Penola, 3 days work, 102 kilometers, almost no man's land. And we've been living in the tents, and we carry everything we have, food, water, and computers, mobile phones. Obviously, there was no modern technology communication advices available back to 160 years ago. So by doing that work, and I feel I have more understanding of how the determinations the Chinese had, from the long way coming into this strange country. The reason is that they're looking for future, they're looking for prosperities, and they're looking for gold. So that's why after first work, I said I want to do more. I want to learn more and educate myself as well. So I organized that every year, did twice work. We work from Ballarat to Bendigo, from Melbourne to Ballarat, then from Robe to Bendigo. Then 2017, we did that big work, and 20 people from Robe to Melbourne, ended up in Parliament House. So that was one of the highlights in my life. I think it's, to me, it's significant. It's a part of it, not just Chinese history. I believe it's Australia history, and that representing the early Australia's history of how people determined to not only to finding the gold, but how to build this country afterwards. So I think that's multiculturalism. It's really good for this country, regardless economically or any other aspect. Look at nowadays in Australia, more than 50% of the people, the parents or themselves, was born in overseas. So that's how beauty of this country is. We have so diversity, and we have so many of those knowledges, cultures, and we be able to pick the good one and build this country bigger, better.
Definitely agree with that. We might open up questions to the audience. Does anyone in the audience have a question that they'd like to ask Paul or Charles? Yes?
I just had a little bit to do with some of the history sort of investigations of the present forest. And just how much is the racism actually worse because these benighted British just lumped all Asians together as Chinese? Because we keep finding references to Chinese. And Dr. John Better, who's a 40-year at Presbyterian Forestry School. Oh, sorry, thank you. Did you hear any of that? No, just Dr. John Petheram, who's a veteran, 40-year veteran, now retired at the Creswick Forestry School. In the last, since his retirement, has spent a lot of time trying to get down as many of the market gardens, the Chinese market gardens and things. And it turns out that at least one of them, which is just recently, last year, got registered with the Heritage Organisation. They were Filipinos. We haven't, and this is the thing, when you said the disparity in the census figures, how much were these benighted British just saying they're all Chinese, but when it came to the census, only X number identified as Chinese, and the others couldn't put down anything because there was no box to tick on the census. You know, they were Filipino, they were blah, blah, blah. And the thing is too that, and then get down to even more detail, because these Filipino people were veterans of the California rush and had gone over there and then come back here apparently. And just how much were they perhaps of Chinese ethnicity, but from the Philippines? It's even murkier than that. And even just to the Europeans, you should hear some of the old Italian and Greek families in Ballarat trying to find history, because it's all Western European history. The French might get mentioned, but nobody's sort of east of Italy. Sorry, I just sort of giggled to myself when you said about the Europeans, because there's that very sort of thing, sort of the French might be accepted into the whole British thing, but the Eastern Europeans and the Italians were a separate category again. But no, just particularly with sort of, is there any way, or have you been able to do it, to sort of go through the old books and things, the old statistics, to find out who actually was Chinese from China, and then who was the different Asian nationalities who sort of ended up here as well?
I think Paul might be better suited to answer this question, and I think it's an interesting thing. When we look at Chinese diaspora, we look at, you know, Chinese not just coming to Australia, but, you know, Chinese who've gone to America, then to Australia, then, or Chinese, you know, maybe in Malaysia who've come here as well. So, but you've done a lot more research into migration patterns, haven't you?
So I'm just going by some of the sort of Creswick family diaries that we looked at too, and they sort of refer to them as Chinese, and then the next sentence is that the Filipinos were here, but the Chinese were over here, for the different market gardens and things like that.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I've been quite interested in this issue of different Asian groups in Victoria and New South Wales, for instance. And in the 1840s, before the gold rush, there were Asian labour recruited in both China and Singapore to work as on sheep stations, whether as shepherds or as cooks or other sorts of labour. Some of the accounts that I've read in the newspapers of people arriving in Geelong in 1848 indicated that many of those who came from Malaysia, Singapore, were actually either Malay or Indian background. And they had more difficulty, they first commented that they had more difficulty with living in Victoria because they weren't used to cold weather, whereas people from South China do have a cold winter comparatively. So there is some information about that diversity. There are quite a few Chinese records of Amoy people, who is a port now called Xiamen in eastern China, where a lot of the original indentured labourers were recruited from, and they became gold miners when the gold rush happened, and they then kept their own group because they speak a different language to Cantonese. They speak Hokkien rather than Cantonese or the Siyip language, which was also spoken here in Ballarat. So there's that, and there's also the Afghans who came out to work as camel train operators in the 1860s. And then there were also Indians who worked as hawkers and also as market gardeners in Victoria and New South Wales. There is information in the census figures. Some censuses are better than others, like some years there they collect more information. There's also information in certificates like garden licences that I mentioned, that I showed an example of, or hawkers licences. You can drill down into the ethnicity of the people if you understand what the names tell you about their ethnicity. But yeah, it's an assumption that everybody was Chinese, that a lot of people have. And in fact, as you say, there was quite a bit more diversity than that. And even within the Chinese, so-called Chinese community, there's a lot of linguistic and cultural difference.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really like that, and there was some great insights in it as well. And also, I'd love to see that flag that you mentioned earlier. I was just wondering that during the Eureka Stockade, many of the key agitators had a history of political action in their home country. I was just, was there a similar case with the key actors in the Chinese resistance that you outlined? And excellent Chinese resistance should be celebrated too, just as a side note. Were they active in their home countries before coming to Australia? And was there similar movements like the Chartist movement or like similar things happening in China at the time?
The answer is yes. It's a good point to make. At the time in the 1850s, there was a major rebellion taking place in China that lasted from about 1854 to 1864. It's called the Taiping Rebellion. And it was people who were wanting to create a new native Chinese dynasty in China, because at that time the Qing dynasty, who governed China, were foreigners. They were not Chinese, they were Manchus from Manchuria. And there had been a movement for centuries to try and overthrow the Manchu and bring back a true Chinese dynasty to run the country. And that fed into the Taiping Rebellion. There was also a number of secret societies that operated politically to try and overthrow the Qing dynasty government, and many of those members came to Australia, both as refugees from the Taiping Rebellion and also as members of these secret societies. And they then brought that capacity to organise and to run political campaigns. There's also a tradition in China, which is quite long-standing, nothing to do with politics per se, but it's the idea of people banding together as a group and forming a union to create some common purpose, whether it be economic or whether it be political. It's called a gongxi. It means common benefit, literally in Chinese, but it was a term that was used also as a translation for the word company in English. So a lot of businesses are called so-and-so gongxi. But it was also the name for the Siap Society, was the Si Gongxi. It meant that it was the common benefit organisation of people from that district. In Borneo in the 1840s, there were large numbers of Chinese who went there for tin mining, gold mining first off, and they moved into an area where there was no Dutch government rule and there was no great sultanate rule by Malay sultans, and it was a jungle with lots of tribal peoples. They formed their own major companies with tens of thousands of people that effectively operated as states, running the mining operations, organising the trade, recruiting, training soldiers, having battles with other groups. It was like a mini-state. It's quite a famous thing if you understand Southeast Asian Chinese history. But that tradition is part of what came to Australia, because it was a Chinese tradition of banding together, collectively organising yourselves, having rules, having leaders, like the Confederacy come out of the tradition. And so having, you will have to pay £3 if you don't follow our rules. That comes out of that tradition of a tight bonded organisation that comes from both China and from Southeast Asia. Yeah.
There is this perception during the 1850s, and one of the many arguments used to exclude the Chinese, that they didn't understand the democratic processes, Western democratic processes, but they had very similar ideals in their own culture, didn't they, as Paul's just documented, in the fact that they participated in terms of monster group meetings, petitions, demonstrated that they did understand democracy. What happens is that there's this perception from when indentured labour, Chinese labour comes, that the Chinese are supposedly a servile race when they're not, and this perception lingers over to the gold rushing immigrants, and sticks to them. It's hard to get rid of. So, there's a lot of... It's to do with people's perceptions and their beliefs of what the previous Chinese immigration have been like, that sort of blinds them to seeing other possibilities as well.
And also we've got the fact that many of these Chinese immigrants to Australia came through Hong Kong or lived in Hong Kong beforehand, or lived in Singapore or Penang, which were all British colonies. And Louis Amoy, who was part of the campaign, he went through Singapore on his way to Australia. Lo Kong Mem was born in Penang. He went to an English school when he was growing up. He was completely fluent in English, both written and spoken, and as well as being fluent in Cantonese and Mandarin. So he was able to organise political discussions between English lawyers in Australia and newspaper campaigners to work with the Chinese community, to do joint campaigns, understanding how you would lobby the government, how you petition the government, how to have delegations, what are the weak points in government policy. So it was both understanding that from the Hong Kong tradition, of understanding how you work with British government there and then bringing that to Australia, but also being fluent enough in English, superbly fluent, to be able to understand British government processes and how to manipulate them to get your achievement.
Thank you for coming today. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank both Paul and Charles for taking the time to share their research, thoughts and ideas with us today. And as I mentioned at the start, if we want to encourage harmony to exist, it's important that we understand the conditions and circumstances that have caused it to disintegrate in the past. So hopefully we can prevent it from doing so in the future. I hope you've enjoyed today's talk as much as I have, and hope it's provided you with lots of food for thought. Thank you for joining us.